Okay, so we are now online. There are some more people in the waiting room. Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. We are going to briefly introduce this meeting and some ground rules, as well as our speakers, and then we will get to the substance. So first of all, why are we here today? So the aim of today's meeting is to provide the timely insights into the UN Food System Summit, which, as you might know, took place on the 23rd of September, so a few days ago. This virtual summit convened thousands of participants, including UN member states, private sector representatives, farmers, producers, civil society participants, and the summit endorsed a holistic and inclusive food systems-based approach to poverty alleviation, nutrition, agricultural production, resource conservation, and of course, climate change. The summit, which was conceived to represent a turning point in the journey to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, promised to be a people summit and a solutions summit, as well as to produce actionable commitments. Now, to what extent did the summit deliver on its promise? Is something that we're going to discuss today with the help of three experts. Before introducing them, I'll have a look at the waiting room. Okay, thanks for helping me admitting the participants. So the three experts that kindly agreed to discuss the outcomes and contents of the summit with us are Matthew Canfield, assistant professor at the University of Leiden. He's a cultural anthropologist with a background in social legal studies. Drawing on ethnographic methods, his research examines the law and governance of global food security and is located at the intersection of human rights, transnational governance, and agro-environmental politics. Matthew is about to publish a book translating food sovereignty, cultivating justice in an age of transnational governance, that will be published in 2022 by Stanford. So congratulations. And then our second speaker is Sigrid Wertheim-Heck, who is an associate professor in global food system sustainability at the Environmental Policy Group of the Wageningen University. She's also professor of food and healthy living at the Irish University of Applied Sciences. Her interest in urban food systems informs her research agenda on the relationship between urbanization, food provisioning, and food consumption. And she leads projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Anna Eskevesta, last but not least, is associate professor of the law group at Wageningen, and she leads our food law research area. Her personal agenda is entitled Food Justice and pursues the following research lines: future-casting the EU food system through anticipatory law, food system solidarity, and a methodological shift in the legal discipline. So as you can see, we have three distinguished speakers, three experts that will help us dig into the contents and outcomes of this summit, which is why, without further ado, I will start asking our speakers the first question. So this is how the meeting is structured. I will ask a couple of questions to the speakers. They will have a chance to reply. You, in the meantime, are free to take notes and prepare your questions, because at the end we will have a Q&A session in which you are very welcome to participate, either in writing in the chat or preferably, if you want, by just taking the floor. So my first question to our three speakers is the following. What are, in your view, the main takeaways of this summit, the main outcomes, the most important results that the summit managed to achieve? And in order to answer this question, I will first give the floor to Sigrid. Sigrid, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Chiara. yeah, very nice to discuss the summit, and there are so many opinions already ventilated around the summit, and I think that is immediately the most important result of outcome of the summit. So the summit indeed was supposed to be a people summit, a solution summit with actionable objectives, and it has received a lot of critique. And I think this is precisely what is the value of the summit. It's not so much in the summit itself, as it has been taking place last week, but the discussions leading up to the summit and hopefully also after the summit. And I think it all comes down to one of the major points of discussions, and that is that if we think that our food system, and I think we kind of all agree with this, is dysfunctional in the way it's currently organized towards the future, then how can we transform this food system? Well, maintaining within the system. So we have to look broader, and especially the stakeholders that were initially closely involved with the UN Food System Summit are main players in our current system. So I think this is now really being debated and has delivered participation, maybe not directly within the food system, but in the global discussion of more indigenous knowledge, and also to think about problem articulation, because that gets to the point of a solution-based summit. So how can you be a solution-based summit if problem articulation is not being done very inclusive? And I think one of the discussions leading up to the summit has really been about what is the problem at a local level for different communities, and what are also knowledge bases and local communities that should be able to help us finding new solutions forward. And I think this is a very important result of the UN Food System Summit, and we should not go above and beyond these local knowledges and these local communities. And that also leads actually to the third point of the promise of the UN Food System Summit on actionable commitment. So how can people commit to things if it is not directly relating to their lived experiences of the food system and to their own activities in addressing these important issues? So I think in looking at what the food system, UN Food System Summit has brought us is actually a real globalized debate between very different stakeholders around the world. So we have been critiquing that the UN Food System Summit was initiated importantly also by the World Economic Forum. And currently it's very clear that we can't address these serious, important global issues by having a corporate perspective only. And I think this is a very important takeaway from this UN Food System Summit. We need to break through our current economic models, through our current economic, food system mega powers on the global scale, to also involve people and activities and initiatives on the local scale. I think that is a very important, for me, result from this UN Food System Summit, and I absolutely hope we continue these fierce debates and discussions and dialogues. Now the UN Food System Summit has ended, so I hope the dialogue does not end by the 23rd of September.
Thank you very much, Sigrid. Thanks for breaking the ice. And I'm happy now to give the floor to Matthew for his own insights.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I have to say, I agree with so many things that Sigrid just said. I think one of the things, my biggest takeaway from the summit is really what we're seeing right now. And part of what the summit did is really create a forum in which we're seeing a battleground between, I think, different models of food system governance. The UN Food System Summit represents a particular model of global food governance, I think, that we have to see within a kind of longer history since the 2007-2008 world food crisis. I mean, during that period, we saw that the sort of neoliberal model of food production and provisioning simply doesn't work, doesn't feed people. And we've seen rising food insecurity on top of, all the things that we know about the ways that our food system is contributing to climate change and the loss of biodiversity and unhealthy diets. So the effects on people and the planet are both dismal right now. And in 2007, 2008, there was a reform of the UN Committee on World Food Security, largely prompted by the kind of mobilization of transnational agrarian movements, who really led the reform of this UN body in a way that reflects this vision of, I would say, decentralized democratic food governance rooted in human rights with strong principles rooted in state decision-making. So they call it inclusive multilateralism. And this body of food governance is really rooted in state authority, and that, there's participation by clearly defined constituencies with meaningful participation. And the UN Food Systems Summit, I think, represents a shift away from that, really a shift towards a different model of food systems governance rooted around multi-stakeholder models in which participation is divorced from this clear identification of meaningful participation and clear constituencies. A recent report was just coming out from the liaison group of the People's Autonomous Response to the UN Food Systems Summit, which analyzed 26 multi-stakeholder initiatives that have worked in the context of food security and nutrition. And they found that across all of these, private sector corporations are overly represented and dominate these models. And that's what I think what we see in the UNFSS. I think in the UNFSS, what we're seeing is really a debate between two different models of authority and legitimacy. One of the big takeaways I think that we should focus on is that the introduction of the food systems frame for governance is really important. It's really a powerful frame that academics and social movements have been pushing for a long time. But one of the things that has opened up is a real struggle over who has authority, what kinds of knowledge do we need for food system governance. And the scientific group, which is a key part of the UN Food Systems Summit, has answered that through a very particular way. They have 29 different participants, 20 are natural scientists, 9 are economists, no social scientists, no lawyers, no socio-legal scholars are involved. And clearly, the UN Food Systems Summit has said, this is the kind of knowledge that's needed for food systems governance. And a different model is offered by the CFS that is much more inclusive, that attends much more to conflicts and different forms of knowledge that are important at local levels. The other question is about legitimacy. And of course, food systems governance needs legitimacy, because if we're going to have food regulation, legitimacy is really important. And there are two different models. One, we're seeing this model of participation rooted around multi-stakeholderism in the UN Food Systems Summit, in which there are no rules, there's no clearly defined constituencies, corporations and philanthropies really dominate it. And in terms of the other part of legitimacy is who's accountable. And one of the things that the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food has been consistently outspoken in is that the UN Food Systems Summit marginalized human rights from the very beginning. It wasn't until 2021, January, in which the human rights even made it onto the agenda. So I think my takeaway is ultimately that we're seeing this real debate, as Sigrid said. But the question for me is, what is the model of governance that's going to enable the kinds of food systems transformation that's really necessary? And one of the things I'll come back to, I'm going to pass it off now, but I think we should talk more as well about what the actual outcomes of the summit are, because I think that is something that's being really celebrated, but I think we should think about what are these outcomes?
Absolutely, and we will have the occasion to discuss that. Hannah, you have now the floor. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Also for organizing the event. And actually what Matt said resonates quite nicely with my first take. I took your question quite literal, so I want to first reflect a bit on the takeaways, and don't worry, I also have some critiques, but I save them for later a little bit. I can find myself in what Sigrid is saying about the summit being organized in a very public way. I personally don't remember the other food summits, and this one certainly is one to remember more than perhaps other ones. It also follows the new sort of process-based organization approach to conferences or conventions, which places more emphasis on the process before instead of a single momentum, an isolated moment. So that's something in terms of process that I think it worked relatively well. Not perfect, but there was this shift that was pretty clear, I would say. The second shift that is overwhelmingly clear, I think, is the food systems thinking terminology which has really been successful. And we may almost forget about it, but the last World Food Summit from 2009 had the goal to eradicate hunger. So systems thinking has, through the summit and before the summit, become so overwhelmingly accepted that this is really something to point out, I think, in the first place. We are framing the food system as part of the problem. I think this is a very strong assumption inherent in the language and in the approach. So we are not only focusing on food as a goal, so eradicating hunger, and we're also sort of finding an alternative to only speaking about agriculture while still keeping with agricultural problematics. So that's also an opportunity, I would say. In that sense, I think the food systems thinking approach as such is much broader in the terms of topics that can be covered. And I think in principle, from a governance perspective, that's commendable, because the problems we can identify through a systems approach are much more holistic than we would be able through an eradicate hunger sort of agenda. So I think that's an opportunity that food systems thinking as a framework brings. That would be my second point. Then on terms of the commitments, of course, so the Food Summit is not a conference of the parties, which means that any outcome was never going to be legally binding by definition. So this is a commitment, and the commitments that are being made are by definition not enforceable, and they are not accompanied by an enforcement mechanism. That results also to some extent in a very fragmented nature, I think, of of countries. And here, I would like to comment on the EU simply because the EU legal system is the one that I am most familiar with. So if we look at what the EU did, and what my takeaway about the EU commitment then to the World Summit is that the EU will be relatively unaffected at the end of the day by the Food Systems Summit. The reason that I'm saying this is because if you looked at what Timmermans has been saying, he said it's a make or break decade. We have to learn to live within planetary boundaries. So it's very interesting to see again this planetary boundary language that's very, I think, characteristic for the discourses. But overall, if you look at what he says, he basically repeats the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy in a literal way. Climate neutrality by 2050, protect 30% of land and sea. We will halve the use of pesticides. We want people to be more healthy, so there's a health agenda in the European Union. They have developed the EU Code of Conduct for Responsible Business, and the European Union seems to think that that's enough to engage with businesses. But overall, the statement was closed with, we want to make the EU food system the global standard of sustainability, so the gold standard, and we invite everybody to join us, so that together we can make sustainable food the global standard. So the European Union clearly sees itself as a standard exporter rather than a political entity that will be affected by the Food Summit as such. So that, I think, was a relatively important takeaway for the European Union, I would say, in those sort of geographically defined takeaways. That doesn't mean that in other countries there would be more. But for the European Union, I think the effect of the World System Summit will be, a Food System Summit will be limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very interesting. Also, this this idea that the EU, of course, within the summit, acted according to its own narrative of a value-based global actor. In the meantime, we are over 70, so I'm very happy that many of you decided to join us. So let's get to another juicy question that, of course, has to do with the gaps that the summit highlighted. So the issues that were not sufficiently addressed or promised, on which the summit did not completely deliver. So I would like you now to express your critical remarks in this respect. Concerning this question, I would like to start with Matthew. Matthew, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, when I'm reflecting on the gaps in the UN Food Systems Summit, I think one of the the largest gap that I would see is that the summit really failed to address power relations within global food systems. I think that is when it comes down to what food production and provisioning is about and shaped by, power is so central. And I would highlight three ways that I think power was really overlooked within the summit. One is what I started by talking about in my last response about sort of epistemic power and power within science. So the scientific group, for example, of the UN Food System Summit, I mean, a lot was unprecedented about this UN Food System Summit, but one of them was the role given to this scientific group, which along with the special envoy, the nomination of Joachim von Braun to lead the scientific group, and the scientific group played a huge role in sort of helping to define what food systems meant. Von Braun said that one of the goals of the scientific group was to develop a kind of uniform, universal definition and approach to food systems. So it clearly played an important role. And for each of the 5 action tracks, each started with a paper that was developed by the scientific group, which really helped to set the terms and the debate for each of the following action tracks. So a lot of power was given to the UN, to the scientific group, and the chairpersons of the scientific group have continued to pursue their own institutionalization within sort of the international landscape through the creation of what is sometimes referred to as an IPCC of food, but a science policy interface. And I mentioned that it's right now a very limited understanding of science that has been promoted by the scientific group. Social science has been left out. There was one white paper that was done with indigenous peoples, but overall, what we've seen is this idea that science, a kind of value-free, objective, unreflexive vision of science has been promoted, which doesn't reflect its own values, assumptions, and forms of power that are invested within it. The second way that I think that power really wasn't addressed is in terms of political economic power in food systems. I mean, one of the main points or main problems that we're seeing in terms of why our food systems look the way they do is really the rise of corporate consolidation and corporate power in food systems. And this question of corporate power was really not addressed by the summit. You know, the kind of question about how we treat food, even in the Secretary General's statement, he said that we shouldn't treat food as a commodity, but rather than a right. But, you know, that kind of question about, you know, how we would do that wasn't actually addressed throughout the summit. And so the question of, you know, what role the private sector should play is something that I think needs further discussion. And of course, the private sector will and continue and should play a role. But I think that a more nuanced and a discussion about kind of how we should address power within global food governance is really important. And then the last one is kind of the normative questions. I think, you know, I said it before that I think human rights were really sort of marginal to the summit at the beginning. They made their way into the summit, but it was really, human rights were really seen as an approach to food systems rather than the way in which we should think about how we are ordering food systems governance more broadly. And so I think this sort of a failure to provide a sort of normative guidance for global food systems governance was really a missed opportunity from the UN Food Systems Summit. And then I'll just say that the last thing, which is that I think one of the things that we see with, you know, Hannah pointed out, this is voluntary, non-binding agreements. You know, by my count, there are 5 action areas, 6 solution clusters, over 250 commitments, 105 national pathways. There is so much going on. And in one way, you could say that's a good thing because it's generating a lot of energy. But at the same time, there are all of these processes happening. And without actually rooting it in normative commitments or any sort of larger structure of food systems governance, I think it allows, you know, powerful actors to basically take the solutions that they see as the most beneficial and run with them. And those solutions that might have less potential for profit making, for example, are going to be sort of left by the wayside. So I think those are the gaps of the Food Systems Summit so far.
Thank you very much, Matt. Already a lot of food for thought. And I would like to remind the audience that after this round of questions to the speakers, you will have an opportunity to ask questions yourself. And I've seen someone already typing a question in the chat. Feel free to do it in writing, but also you're very welcome to take the floor when we start the Q&A. So I will now move on to Hannah for her remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a number of remarks, and again, I think they tie in well with what Matt is saying. So if I stick perhaps first to my disciplinary legal thoughts about the summit, I think from a legal perspective, food is a very interesting case. So we already heard from Matt that the human rights approach was sort of neglected, and then there was a pretty big outcry when the UN Special Rapporteur person for food publicly, or actually all of them publicly, greatly discredited the UN World Food System Summit as such, and the negligence of human rights therein. But even food and human rights is a relatively contentious issue, and the right to food has its limitations as well. It does rely on states, and even from a legal sources perspective, it is not that clear what the right to food would actually entail. It's dispersed in different legal instruments. So from an international legal point of view, the human right approach to food also has internally its flaws that we should not forget about. That said, it is of course an important approach, or you actually don't like this word, I think, the approach to food systems, but it's of course an important legal norm. Then we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which again, there is no development goal explicitly dealing with food. You know, they all tangibly come in through hunger eradication and so forth. But again, here we see that food becomes always very fragmented when it comes to legal norms. And I would have really wished that the Food Systems Summit would have looked at the legal system on food and at least made it more systematic in terms of how it's going to deal with it, just from a legal perspective, because these are internationally legally binding or semi-binding guidelines, and it would have been very important to just systematize them, inventorize them, and find the gaps there. I think that would have been something that was very feasible, but somehow it was completely neglected. I think there are things we haven't even spoken about. For instance, the World Trade Organization, you know, in terms of agriculture and the trade in food, it is hugely important, and it is actually legally binding. But the word WTO, I think, was not even mentioned in any of the Food Summit documents. So there clearly, in terms of legal sort of coherency between international norms, there was a huge opportunity that has been missed. And I think that from a legal scholar perspective, of course, is something, that is really a missed opportunity in my personal point of view. The second one, I can really only elaborate I think on what Matt said about that the food system really failed to deliver on trust. I think this is something that it should have done, and it really didn't do it. By contrast, it actually it brought to the foreground all these different interests, and the fact that the UN summit, the UN system in itself is not very clear. And it also brought out this sort of flawed organizational aspect, where certain parts of an organization are included and other parts are all of a sudden excluded. For instance, you mentioned it before, but the exclusion of the UN Committee on World Food Security from much of the organization and inception is, in some ways, it's really unprecedented. And so that's really the foundation of the summit, which failed to deliver on trust. Secondly, the scientific group, again, you mentioned it, but it is really remarkable that an economist should lead a scientific group on food, which arguably could have benefited from a biologist or a chemist or an agricultural expert. But perhaps less so from an economist. And then if we look at the composition of the biographies, so I went through them, not only are there 9 economists, also the sort of more natural science-oriented people, they are all coming from very either genetically friendly places or food and technological places. So there is a real enormous bias in this scientific group biography sort of composition, and that just doesn't bode well for what comes out of there. If you look at their outputs, I find them also equally, frankly, almost bad in terms of how they are written. There are few references. The definition of the food system, I think, has at most 9 references in a 15-page paper, for example. So in terms of the output that the scientific group so far has delivered, I would also argue that it is far from stellar. And lastly, the creation of an IPCC for food is an idea that was launched from the very beginning without apparently any research or openness towards other solutions. So when you already present the solution from the very beginning, I think that's, you know, again, in terms of the process, that's a very, very, something that one has to be careful about. I want to engage briefly also with this idea of the creation of an IPCC. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it is actually tasked with making science and really not that much with making policy suggestions. So in that sense, already the scientific group really overstepped its own mandate by, you know, making a policy suggestion without any consultation and very firmly sticking to it as well. But if we take this idea of an IPCC, you know, serious, then why do we have it? We have it because there is uncertainty in climate change, and climate change is a clearly global problem. What we fail to perhaps consider more seriously is that food, to some extent, is not a global problem. There is the question of scale, and food policy especially is a very local problem. This is in big contrast to climate change, which by definition is a global problem and will always be a global problem. Some problems in food need a phrasing at a certain scale that is more local than global. And I think therefore, just to copy an IPCC mechanism as an idea already has certain flaws. And I think this flaw is also inherent in the Food Summit, which on one hand, it is based on intergovernmental commitments, but the summit itself, it does not address sufficiently, I think, the meso scale, right? It's either global, the Global Food Summit, or it is at the country level, so it's intergovernmental. But anything in between in terms of regional approaches or non-nation state approaches is very much falling through the crack. And I think this from in terms of approach could have been an opportunity to use for the World Food Summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And last but not least, I will give the floor to Sigrid for her remarks on this point. Thanks, Sigrid.
Yes, thank you. A lot has been said, and it's hard to disagree with the previous speakers. But coming as a social scientist working with lived experiences of food environments, I actually mostly resonate also with the last remark of Hannah, that how we look at the food system on a global, regional or local level. And therein also how this resonates with kind of illusion of uniformity in food system approaches as suggested by the UN Food System Summit, and also in ways it has defined some key concepts by including a limited set of scientists and private sector stakeholders in it. So coming back actually to my first remark is that what I missed is the challenge of discussing the economic drivers of our food system. So it seems that this is such an inconvenient truth that our current economic system fails us in advancing our food system into more sustainable pathways, that this is not being really discussed And I think it is really problematic because our economic system is definitely also part and parcel of the inequalities on a global scale, and how solutions as well as problems are differentiated across the globe. And I think this is one of the major issues I have with the UN food system approach as we have seen it. And I think it is so important because there was so much voicing also preceding the UN Food System Summit that precisely asked for including these local voices that have experienced how, for instance, also our current pandemic has worked out in their everyday lives, and that we can use that and utilize that as learning how we can actually alter our current food system on a more fundamental way. And of course, as the moment that you have people with important stakes, very powerful stakes around the table, this is easily, actually conveniently being avoided. And I think that is one of the major issues I'm confronted with. So what would have happened if we would have communities from around the globe facing certain powerful policymakers at a European scale or at a corporate level scale and discussing their really lived experiences face to face? Would it have actually opened up new ways of discussing food system transformation? And that's something I really wonder, and I would have loved if we can continue with these type of dialogues. And also because what I'm afraid of, and if we have a UN Food System Summit like this, and we get all these nice words coming out and ambitions of having community of practices, etc., that we do not create an illusion that we are advancing our food system, because I think it is super crucial that we address it as of today, and that can't be done by only staying within the food systems frame at all. So I think that if we look, for instance, and I think this is such actually an illustrative but a very unfortunate case, if we look at Somalia, how Somalia has been impacted by the climate crisis, how the whole ecosystem there has been has changed over the turn of 2 decades, from a green landscape to now this desert, unproductive land. This is mainly the result of our European or Western or American, Chinese, whatever, where we industrialize societies. So I think it is going beyond the food system as well. And we need to take this approach. So when indeed I hear Frans Timmermans speak about that we are setting the standard, I feel almost like ashamed. Is that a standard that we want to set in terms of food system? Because it's not only limited to our food system. We have created this imbalance also within this world. So that is an important point I would still like to make. And another important point is that we tend to ignore that a very large part of the food people consume on this globe is coming from smallholder farmers. And just having the illusion that it comes from these big, powerful players indeed are powerful, I think can also be contested. If, for instance, about 50% of the food produced come from smallholder farmers, then who holds the power? I think they hold the power as well. They hold the power to the future, to more biodiversity and agro-food systems as well. And we should acknowledge this very importantly. And then thirdly, in advancing our food systems, I think it's also very important to understand what is food to whom and under what conditions. So we are talking about also changing diets. And I think that's where social sciences is absolutely crucial, because we don't consider the same products food across the globe. And for instance, we discuss also here in the Netherlands, we discuss the protein transition. I think the protein transition is in itself an absolutely Western concept, because if I talk about protein transition and I go to Vietnam, where I lived for 9 years, they look at me and they don't understand it. They are glad they can eat some meat. So these are also Western concepts that we should not just export to other sides of the world. And opening up what do we consider food today? but also tomorrow. And what is food around the globe in relation to the change of our food system, I think is absolutely crucial. And this is where we need to learn from local communities. We need to open up the windows and really start to engage in dialogues in which power falls away. So it's not a CEO or a scientist against some local population somewhere on the other side of the globe. It's really opening up, listening, understanding what's going on locally. And I think if we are advancing this kind of communities of practice, this should be the focus of those communities of practice. So how do we impact each other around the globe with our local activities? And actually that's a big plea to look at local consumption and the values that and the functions that food serves beyond nourishment, to look at local production systems and how they contribute in a powerful way to global food production, and also to really question our economic systems that has brought us where we are nowadays, and whether we maybe need some really different value systems for advancing our food system.
Thank you very much, Sigrid. I'm really grateful for all the speakers' remarks. I've already taken 2 pages of notes, so this was really informative, and I think it really constitutes a good basis for a discussion. Actually, I already see in the chat a couple of questions. I would like to ask Bart, if you would like to ask your question or questions by taking the floor, perhaps.
Well, not necessarily. I think they are quite self-explaining, and maybe to the panel is indeed the question now: what's next? Basically, how do these models relate to each other? And we observe, and we all agree, I think, in this community, what has been said. I can't repeat it. It's not. It's quite obvious, but how we relate to it, and looking for ways how to change the incentives in the economic system that directs all the food systems in the wrong direction. Basically, that's it. And that's a very, very difficult question where, and I agree with Sigrid, that social science has been very absent. And we cannot answer that question without engaging and discovering how these models relate to each other, how the skills relate to each other, and what are mechanisms of influence. And that is about rebalancing, but also in terms of empowering and addressing these issues, even if the bigger powers just are whitewashing our agenda. And I think that has to be object of further debate, is that question of empowerment of different interests and how they can be mobilized. And there are all over the world, there are examples where communities are mobilizing in one way or another. Maybe we doesn't yet recognize it as such, but there are many ways of mobilization now starting. And I think that requires our attention.
Thank you very much, Bart. Perhaps I will also take another question before giving the floor back to the speakers. Alberta, I see your question in the chat. If you prefer to ask it yourself, feel free to take the floor. Otherwise, I can read it. But
Thank you. I'm a bit shy, but I would like to speak out. So thank you so much. So my question was addressed to Hannah in particular, but of course, all the panelists were great. So any additional insight would be really appreciated. No, my question was around this, around the dimension of global, the global dimension of the climate versus the food problems, which is it possible to elaborate more, because I was really interested to hear more about it, because first, maybe what I didn't read in the chat, just to know if this is an issue of perception, so how this problem is perceived by people or by analysts, or this is really an evaluation of the analysis that there is this difference between food perceived as local problems and climate more a global a local problem versus climate more as a global problem. Also because personally I think that there are so many global drivers, and for many of us in the non-profit sector working on food, and especially food as a human right, we see really a lot of global drivers leading to food insecurity, hunger. And so I would just like to ask a bit more about this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberta. I think I can actually give the floor to the speakers and then we will collect other questions. Who would like to start? Anna, perhaps, given that the question was mainly addressed at you.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I'm first gonna give the narrower answer and then the broader answer. So when I contrasted climate change with food, in first instance, I think it's really also worthy to reflect on this in the specific context of the IPCC and the IPCC for food. So in that sense, if we reflect on the IPCC, it is meant to discover, to institute an independent body of knowledge for climate change. And climate change there is understood very scientific, and it is not meant to make policy suggestions. So in that sense, the IPCC for food, as it was then discussed, was more a policy vehicle at the end of the day. And in that sense, I think it was just interesting to really appreciate what the IPCC does and what it doesn't do before then using it as a blueprint for an IPCC for food in the first place, apart from whether the idea how it was generated is good or bad. Then I think the food sector is, from a legal perspective, anyways, very special. I think in the chat you were asking about the global dimension of food as opposed to climate. So I think that the framework for food is much more incidental than that one for climate. In the sense, food is really an afterthought of trade. It's an afterthought of agriculture. It's in some way an afterthought of biodiversity when we're speaking about seeds and seed governance, for instance. And what I wanted to suggest is that the Food Systems Summit could have brought forward how food is actually regulated incidentally by all these global international law instruments. So in that sense, I think that's a task which we haven't done so far, and climate change is much more advanced in this respect. I'm not saying we found the solution for climate change, but I think food is just way more behind in terms of consolidating the legal sources. So in case I think you were asking for examples, you know, the World Trade Organization simply limits the regulatory autonomy of member states. So you can't just even institute a ban on seal products, for instance, like the European Union had done, right? This was challenged in the WTO. Organic regulation is going to be challenged in the WTO. So these are really hardcore legal limitations to the regulatory power, even to pursue good goals, as it were, of member states. So that's something I think it's just simply unexplored. And the other element that you mentioned were, I think, the seeds. And here, of course, we have a very powerful intellectual property right regime in the world, and it is a regime which does, to some extent, protect the appropriation of nature. Right, resources belong to someone, and they are protected. So these are really elements which have massive implications for a food system, but they are legally enshrined, and those are very sophisticated international legal frameworks, I would say. So this is, I think, the difference.
Thank you. Would the other speakers be willing to reply as well? Sigrid, perhaps?
Yeah, I have no legal background. More again from a local perspective, but I think it is important in governing the whole transition, I think we see globally a certain trend, and it's a trend towards more localized governance arrangements on food systems and inclusiveness of actually citizens within food system transformation. So once we take an approach on food system transformation from a kind of universal approach and a more top-down approach, we actually disregard what's going on across the globe. And now we've seen it in the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. And I thought the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact was strikingly silent in relation to the UN Food System Summit, which I thought was quite strange, because there are urban areas, so it's not even on a nation state, it's really on an urban scale that policymakers are taking the driving seat in food system change and looking at more regional perspectives on food system transformation. But of course, that has implications for areas further away and even across the globe. And in these type of dynamics are really important to acknowledge. So on the one hand, yes, there are limitations to the UN Food System Summit, but luckily the UN Food System Summit has been an event that has had a lot of attention and brought a lot of discussion, which I think is good to have these dialogues. But on the other hand, in the meantime, really on a local scale, cities across the globe and areas across the globe are really making big changes in their food system approaches locally. And this is super important because it breaks through traditional boundaries of what do we value in food systems, having also had different value approaches by reconnecting consumption with production, for instance, but also by changing and challenging regulations. So what do we think is a just and right food environment, and how does it relate to urban infrastructures, and what we allow in urban areas to shape up as a food environment? All these dynamics are equally important. And of course, this doesn't solve a kind of global north, global south, although I think it's an unjust qualification discussion on equity. It does address dynamics on a local scale, which is increasingly embraced in cities across the globe. And that's not only in the global north, that includes cities in the global south, including Africa, including Asia, including Latin America, that are taking their own driving seat in finding solutions for very urgent issues. And I think there is a way, and that is also relating to the question of Bart, because that is, of course, I think the most important question to address. Then how do we change this food system? And maybe we should not only look at a kind of global solution for all, but really look at what type of solutions are authorities and private sectors and civil society organizations and citizens at a local scale trying to advance and find out themselves there. And what can we learn from that? I think there are seeds for opportunities for change also on a global level when we look at this more localized dynamics in governing food system transformation.
Thank you, Sigrid. Matt, do you have any remarks on these initial questions and comments?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but I think Bart, I agree. This is the question about how to change incentives. And I think one of the problems of the UN Food System Summit is that it incorporates this multi-stakeholder framework as the approach for food systems governance. I mean, since 2007, 2008, the World Economic Forum has promoted multi-stakeholderism, first through what was called the Global Redesign Initiative, and then was rebranded as the Great Reset. And fundamentally, this multi-stakeholder model is actually meant to sort of suppress collective mobilization and collective representation and prevent the empowerment of communities by, creating their own mechanisms for self-representation, which was key to the reform of the UN Committee on World Food Security in 2007, 2008. Because of course, as Sigrid said, 70% of the world's food is produced by smallholder producers and workers, and their voices are so important. And yet, one of the things that we see is that the model that is promoted of participation through multi-stakeholderism really is meant to sort of repackage kind of corporate and philanthropic approaches. I mean, we could look at a lot of the coalitions that have come out, like, for example, inclusive seed systems, rebranding this idea of inclusive seed systems. This is led by the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, by GAIN, by Plantum, by the International Seed Federation, and it's all about extending seed value chains and creating markets for the global seed industry, which is one of the most concentrated industries that exists, with three large-scale producers, or three producers that dominate the global market. So I think that's one thing that, we have to look at the model of multi-stakeholderism when we're thinking about empowerment and how incentives are being aligned. And then the other thing I just want to say, which was just a complete and utter shock, was that COVID-19 was simply unaddressed by the UN Food System Summit. What were the causes of the food system crises? How does COVID-19 impact food systems? And what kinds of lessons should we learn from it? I think one of the lessons that we learn is that short supply chains and that, are more resilient, more equitable, and more sustainable. But that's not something that was really discussed within the UN Food System Summit. And so this glaring absence of actually addressing the COVID-19 crisis, I think, is part of, and again, sort of the problems that the Food System Summit, as it developed, even amidst this, this really wide-scale political crisis. So I just wanted to add those two things.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So Shined is asking whether there is a summit outcome document or communique that will be released by the UN. As far as I know, a final report has not been issued yet, but of course, if the speakers know more than me, please let us know. Then I have two other questions in the chat. I think Violet would like to ask it herself. And Hideki, who has the second question, please feel free to ask it yourself if you would like to take the floor. Otherwise, I will read it for you. Let me know in the chat. Violet, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting insights from everyone. Thank you so much. So perhaps the first part of the question is directed at Hannah. I'm interested in about the rules or norms in such a summit as this. Like who are the kind of, you could say, gatekeepers, who's deciding who's invited with regards to participation. And then also maybe more widely for the other speakers as well, like how can we bring kind of, I guess, what are the problems in getting increased participation? Why is it not happening? Perhaps to do with these gatekeepers, but maybe some other problems you can suggest. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's an interesting question, especially because the food summits have been convened by different entities, as it were. I think there was another one which was more convened by FAO, while this one was convened by the UN Secretary General. I think the media stories are relatively clear in linking the World Economic Forum as a sort of birthplace for this idea. And then it was, as it were, announced from the UN Secretary General. And more practically, the norms which would govern how such a summit is convened or designed are to a large extent actually written in sort of terms of references. So I'm not sure how at the inception it goes if there is a mandate that's perhaps sort of rubber stamped or something like that in the assembly. But I think in all terms of practicalities, what it boils down to is that someone in the administration drafts terms of references, and then sort of the organization is sort of undertaken on this basis. For instance, about the scientific group, you will find, and I think that's a relatively surprising sort of move, right? It's a very influential position, and the Secretariat General simply appoints Joachim von Braun as the chair of the scientific group and sends him terms of references of sort of gathering these experts who have the mandate to support the scientific side. So what they can do and sort of the limitations are circumscribed in the terms of reference, and also sort of the limitations can be spelled out therein, but they are relatively free, I think, in setting and designing these participatory processes, and they could go either way at the end of the day. Yeah. So it's a relatively administrative procedure, but I think there's a lot of scope for personnel decisions that have a lot of influence on content ultimately.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. And in the meantime, Matthew has kindly linked to the final statement of the Secretary General that is now published online. Perhaps we can, before giving the floor also to Matthew and Sigrid, we can collect other questions, because there is one directly addressed at Sigrid and one which is more for Matthew. Hideki, would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah. So first of all, so thank you for all the partners and also participants. So my question is, like, so as you mentioned, Matthew, so like the scientific approach is very important, and which is tendent to be, you know, lacked in this type of argument, especially like food systems, you know. But you know, like, so with respect to the scientific approach, so it could be very, you know, broadened. So you know, there should be a lot of scientific approach is necessary or very important, you know, but I don't, you know, really understand, especially what kind of approaches are necessary and lacked this type of context. So, you know, in order for me to really understand what happens now. So this is a question to Matthew, and also, sorry, but I have just a comment with another kind of topic. So as Sigrid mentioned, so, you know, like, for me, from my perspective, I mean, my Japanese perspective, where I was born and grew up, so especially like protein shift, protein transition or something like that, is kind of really Western approach. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, you know, like, it's a little bit weird. Why are you starting, you know, discussing this type of matter right now? I mean, for us, so the Japanese, especially, you know, food culture is a bit different from Western culture, and you know, a bit complicated, you know, like to understand what really happens in the West. I mean, the protein shift in a Western perspective. So I think in some culture there is not so many, I mean, protein lack at this moment, and also we needed to more, I mean, you know, mix up with each other culture to discuss about this kind of thing. So yeah, that's why, you know, like, this is just a comment, but you know, I really agree what Sigrid says in this type of dimension. So sorry, but you know, like, this is a question to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I see a comment by Armand who says, I agree with Sigrid on the importance of citizen city actions as being underrepresented in this global force. That's where much more action is taking place currently, and perhaps that's where rebalancing and mobilizing needs to happen. Thank you for the comments. And then let's take just another question. There is a question by Irene. Irene, if you don't mind, I'm going to read it in the interest of time. Irene says, I'd be interested to know also from Matthew's side what the first next step is that we as viewers, as Wageningen University community should take. What can we bring to the table that can make a positive change towards the future of food system? This is a good question for all the panelists, including Matthew, who is our guest today. So perhaps I will first give the floor to Matthew and then to Sigrid.
Okay, well, these are great questions. In terms of Hideki, is your question about what other kinds of knowledge, and I would reframe it as what kind of knowledge is necessary, because it's not just science. Of course, we need specialist knowledge. We're all in universities. This is the work that we do. But of course, it's also about how we're translating between the local and the kinds of practices that we do and the knowledge practices that we do. So, I mean, one thing that was glaringly missing, I think, was, if we're thinking just from the natural sciences, I mean, there was an agroecologist, somebody who does agroecology, but I think agroecology, which is a transdisciplinary science that includes, of course, specialist knowledge, but also local and indigenous knowledge, and brings them together through participatory research, that was something that was really missing from the summit. And I think, in general, I would say, from the natural science perspective, Hannah noted that a lot of the kind of science, it was geared towards sort of those that are focused on technology-centered approaches. So I think there are a whole lot of questions around agronomy that could be, further integrated, ones that are rooted around, local solutions to problems, rather than this kind of this value-free, unreflexive vision of science that was really promoted by the summit. I mean, I was really shocked that the scientific group claimed that they could help countries decide trade-offs for, when these are values that are actually, as Sigrid said, food is so much about values that are rooted in local contexts. And so the fact that, from a scientific background, I think science can help illuminate what are those contradictions, what are the conflicts. And that's what it should be doing, and offering perspectives rather than trying to, facilitate and solve these trade-offs, which I think gives, it's a little bit too much hubris for science. I mean, as different lawyers, as social scientists, I think, we need to bring a different perspective of how we're thinking about science in general. And then the other question, I mean, what can we do as Wageningen University, and I'll say as academics and students? I think that we have a huge role to play. And I think these kinds of discussions, I think, one of the things Sigrid started by saying is that these kicked off these discussions, and that food systems transformation, yes, it's going to happen at this important governance questions are really important, but really at the local level is really where we're seeing a lot of momentum, where we're, building movements and connections between producers and consumers, and helping to develop more holistic models for thinking about what food systems transformations are necessary. I mean, one of the things that the food systems framework that was introduced by the summit offers us a whole lot of connections to bring in, whether we're talking about climate, economic systems. And I think that it's our job to really bring that complexity in, that there's no one model, and that sort of this empirical approach to local solutions is really going to be what we can bring our knowledge to, and also the voices of people who may not be able to participate in the summit. I mean, one of the things that was clear in the summit is that, because it was entirely online, there were many people who simply could not participate because people lack broadband and internet access in rural areas. And these are the people who are most important to be participating. So I think as scholars, we have an opportunity to bring in those perspectives and to work with those communities to develop solutions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Sigrid, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I've not too much to add, because I definitely do think that global issues require local differentiated approaches. I think that is the basic of everything. So we need to have that understanding. But I'm also really interested in the question about, indeed, what can we do also as scientists? And it resonates to a discussion we had last week with our own Wageningen Center of Sustainability Governance on the role of science and the role of scientists, and in relation to objectivity and maybe also normativity in debate. And I think our role as scientists is just playing part of the puzzle. On the one hand, questioning and researching set directions where people think that it can offer solutions, but does it offer solutions everywhere under every condition? That is something that we as scientists may question, and as well we may advance science to offer new opportunities and new directions. It may be a one-fits-all and might also not be the perfect solution in the end, but it's helping us guide along this pathway of creating more sustainable food systems. So I think that's one way, and we need to be objective. We need to be able to discuss. We need to be able to agree to disagree. We need to be able to talk to people with maybe inconvenient messages to our own agenda. So I think that is absolutely critical, and we need to safeguard this. We need to harness it, because one of the most detrimental things, I think, is that science might lose its credibility. There's a kind of eroding confidence in science, and we can't afford it at this moment. So I think that is, for me, really absolutely crucial. But that being said, of course, if we want to advance something, we are also maybe people on it with a mission. So having some maybe normative opinions as a scientist and voicing those and substantiating these with objectifiable maybe research findings is also not wrong. But we need to make a clear distinction between when we talk science and when there is a scientist having a kind of opinion in relation to the debate, and both are equally important, I guess. So, and I think this is something that maybe when we think about our own science, or also about our education, this is something that we have to take also our students along in these kind of discussions. Okay, what is your personal stance? And especially when it is about greening and students working in our field, they come from kind of, they strive to make the world a better place, which I applaud. But it is also immediately maybe having a risk of a certain bias of perspective, and therewith not embracing other views and opinions. And I think this is something that we should harness as a scientist within our own community. So what is science, and who are you as a scientist with your own point of departure in taking place in science at all? And I think the UN Food Systems Summit has also challenged these kind of discussions. So that's its main function. So I come back to where I started today. I think these debates have never been so fierce as we have seen them over the past year, and they can't be fierce enough, because there's a lot of issues to be resolved. And we need to also allow to try out things in practice, and these can best be done on a local scale, because then also the implications can be also more manageable. So I think opening up our horizons is definitely important, and also looking at local contextualized implications is absolutely crucial, because that's where change happens in the end. Though being connected, of course, on a global scale. But I would definitely like to plea for harnessing our role as scientists in these debates.
Thank you, Sigrid. And before giving the floor to Hannah, if she has reflections also on this point of the role of academia, I would like to add another question for Hannah that came from Francesca Colli. Professor Sebesta, do you think that the One Health approach could help, and if so, how, the transition towards sustainable food systems from a legal perspective? Hannah, do you have any remarks on these two questions?
Yes, I think the distinction between academia and science is probably crucial. As an academic, I think to safeguard our independence is our uttermost, I would say, mandate, because it is the prerequisite of science or of scientific endeavors. More specifically, how should we conduct science for food systems? In my view, it's very important to come to a more holistic approach, and I think that's why I also like the question by Francesca Colli very much about the One Health approach. So if we do science for food systems, I think one of the things we haven't talked about so far is the outer boundaries of the food system, and that, of course, it is actually in itself a subsystem that is linked then to the environment, to the animals, and so forth. So, of course, what I would derive from that is that we should take a very holistic approach and therefore, respect all natural sciences in a very sort of diverse manner. so chemists, biologists, agricultural people, environmental policy people, and also to strengthen the link between the social sciences and the natural sciences. So I think these are the elements that I think sometimes are missing, where perhaps planetary boundaries is very natural science oriented, while perhaps the social scientists are not always well versed in the natural science aspects. So I think that's a challenge that we still have to overcome, and then also to move beyond food, because food as it's in itself is just a subsystem. And to answer Francesca Colli on her question, yes, I think the One Health approach, it depends what you understand under the One Health approach. If you understand, well, food, animals, or human animals and the environment are integrated in one approach, then certainly this is a way forward. In the European Union, I think this is a more tangible policy initiative, I would say. It's not that mature, but it is a direction that we definitely are going towards. And of course, it's very much needed, because these are exactly the things which in the European Union are missing. You know, we have chemicals which migrate from inks into our food. We have the so-called forever chemicals, which, you know, they are not degradable. So these are challenges which you can't really approach them from a food alone perspective, I would say. And that's why I think the One Health approach is definitely the future. And yes, I think it's also for academia and for science the way to go, as it were. I also wanted to mention the comment from Francois, if that's all right, because I think it's an important one. He sort of questioned that the UNFSS will not affect EU policy making. And he refers to the EC high-level expert group's report, which pretty clearly endorses science policy interface. So perhaps I should have been, you know, more precise with my words. I think in terms of the policies pursued by the European Union itself, the summit will not have great influence on the content. It is true that I think the European Union is getting ready to be an exporter of knowledge and an exporter of opinions and an exporter of views. And that's, in my view, where this high-level report comes from. It was quite clear that the outcome of this UNFSS was always going to be an IPCC, sadly so. And the European Union is getting ready to have an opinion there. I think this is where it comes from. But this should lead us actually to question more the processes, because how is it possible that it was clear from the very beginning, you know, before the start of the process, that an IPCC for food would be created, you know, having a lot of policy dialogues on top of it, with the result that an IPCC for food called an SPI is going to be created. I mean, that's a little bit the sort of frustrating, I would say, observation that we can have about the summit. But I think, sorry, to be very short, I think Francois is right in that this is going to be an impact also on the European Union, but actually not on its internal policies.
Thank you, Anna, also for picking the last question, the comment in the chat. Of course, I encourage, we still have like 10 minutes if you want, so I encourage you to ask your questions if you have any. In the meantime, I will abuse my role as chair to actually make my own comments. Because I learned about the contents of this summit mostly from you, from your interventions today, and I was actually, I mean, impressed, not in a good way, by what it seems to be really the sidelining of the concept of responsibility from the summit. It's true that it's not a conference of the parties, that no enforceable outcome what was going to come out of it. At the same time, I find it very concerning that any normative framework has been sort of put on the side. And I agree with Anna, of course, that the very concept of the right to food is a very, in a way, controversial one. It doesn't, I mean, much can be discussed about its contents, its interpretation, its application at the local level, and so on. At the same time, human rights are, as a normative framework, assign responsibilities, and bringing them into the picture means also clearly stating that there is a necessary balance to be drawn between economic developments, the interest of corporations on the one hand, and certain internationally protected values on the other. And there are subjects that bear clear obligations to ensure that this balance is drawn. And these are primarily states, not only in their domestic policies, but also as members of the international organizations, including the WTO, within which they are operating and taking decisions. So to me, it's very concerning that these normative frameworks are not amply reflected in this debate on food systems, also because you mentioned that the economic drivers or the international trade regulatory system were not integrated so much in the debate, and I really don't see how we can possibly divide these systems. I will not, it seems to me a bit of the situation that we have in the realm of climate change, whereby states speak about common but differentiated responsibilities, but then how do we actually differentiate these responsibilities in practice is not clear. And it is evident that, the global South is suffering, including in terms of the food system, is suffering more than the global North, and at the same time, the subjects that are most responsible of the current situation in terms, for instance, of loss of biodiversity, climate change, are not taking more responsibility, or not necessarily so, to resolve the situation. So I would have liked to see mentioned, for instance, that the international instruments that establish the responsibilities of corporations in terms of human rights, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, given the big role that is given to the private sector, and that was given to the private sector in this summit. So it seems to me that the issue of responsibility, both responsibilities of states and the ones of corporations, unfortunately, has remained a bit on the side. This is my comment, but I think we have probably one more question in the chat. Shirin says, do you think that the European Union should be the one exporting the knowledge and opinions, or are there other places we should pay more attention to? I think in part we have answered this question, but we can actually have some final remarks about this. Okay, yes, and then Francois commented, wrote a follow-up comment. You can read it in the chat. So I think I will, at this point, give the floor to the three speakers for a final round of remarks, if any, of course, and perhaps to answer this last question by Shirin. I will start from Anna, perhaps. Would you like to go first?
Well, I'm almost at the stage to ask the audience a question, which is, how do you think it's going to play out for the European Union position on the IPCC for food, or not? If someone has a sort of informed view on this, I would be relatively interested to hear that. Yeah, I think there is a question about whether I think the European Union should be an exporter of knowledge and opinions, or are there other places? Well, I think on one hand, the European Union is a very sort of solid knowledge broker, and we definitely have worse ones. So the European Union has relatively independent scientific processes, and as such, I think it's not a per se extremely biased voice to hear. So in that sense, I think the European Union is a voice that is respectable. Of course, it can never be the only voice and should not be. And first of all, in global processes, I think we are talking about equality and procedural rights, power relationships. So these things can never happen when one person simply exports their view through power relationships on export markets, for instance, in food trade, for example. And that's something that this food summit, however, did by relying on governments or sort of governmental structures, right? So in that sense, no, I'm not of the opinion it should be this way, but the European Union does use its position on the global trade market and in power relationships simply to have an important opinion. So it was not a normative statement. The other places that we should pay attention to are all places of the world, right? And that's where we come back to the question of scale, which is that food policy making can work at different localities and at different scales. I think the European Union, because of its legally integrated nature, is a great scale for action for food. But for countries which are not integrated as much in regional areas or for islands, this may not at all make sense. So the answer, I think, will be very individual. Which kind of voices should be heard. But we need to have processes that can respect perhaps the questions of scale.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Sigrid, do you have some final remarks?
Yeah, we'll keep it short, but actually in line with what Hannah just said, I want to give an Asian perspective. So I think we should be careful also within the EU to remain relevant for the rest of the world. I've lived in Asia for 9 years, and I see how Asia actually became a region in itself, and also how produce is being prioritized within the Asian region. Produce that we often depend upon for our year-round food availability in the EU. And I think this is really important to realize that ongoing dynamics in different locations across the world are really directly impacting also our own stance within this global food system transformation challenge. So I give a very simple example, and I've used it before, is that I worked for kiwi fruits and marketing them within Asia. And when there was a kind of shortage of certain kiwi fruits, they were prioritized actually from New Zealand to markets within Asia, like Japan, China, Vietnam, because simply said, the price people pay there for a single fruit is higher than the EU. The logistics costs are lower because the distance, of course, is smaller, but also the landing costs are lower and the rejection rates are lower. So that means that in terms of production shortage, the Asian market is prioritized above the European market. And these are dynamics that are ongoing, and we should be aware of them as well. So it is the world is changing very rapidly, and the position of the European Union within this world is also changing very rapidly. So I think it remains, I keep on saying it, we need to be very sensitive to contextual developments at regional and local scales. And I think that is where we should advance our future endeavors within these local skills.
Thank you, Sigrid. And Matthew, the floor is yours for the last comments.
Maybe I'll end on a positive note. I think one of the things that happened as a result of the summit is not just these debates, but it encouraged civil society organizations, transnational grain movements to become more organized than they ever have before. I mean, the 2007-2008 food crisis was a moment in which we really saw movements like La Via Campesina, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, and other social movements really come together to help in the reform of the UN Committee on World Food Security. And over the past 10 years, there's been lots of geopolitical changes, lots going on in terms of, the reorganization of the corporate sector and consolidation. But one of the things that in the last year and a half has happened is that social movements mobilized in counter summits for both the pre-summit and during the regular summit. And we saw that, there was a common African position that was articulated. We saw movements that from Latin America and North America and Australia come together. And one of the things that we're seeing is that it's really important, if this summit is going to have any effects is that civil society needs to be empowered. And again, at the local level is really important, because the UN Food System Summit is now moving down to national pathways. And so at the national level, and having civil society organizations that are engaged, that are connected globally, but also working at that local level is so important. And I think that we're seeing that. And the other thing I'll say is that there are immense important processes coming up in the Committee on World Food Security and the high-level panel of experts on youth, on women, and new conversations about the inclusion of LGBTQI people in that, and on digitalization. So I think that these debates will continue, and that we're likely to see, you know, lots of conflict, but also a newly energized and empowered civil society that I'm looking forward to seeing what comes from it.
Thank you very much, Matthew, also for ending on a positive note. Indeed, there are, I mean, of course, we have focused on the criticalities today, but our speakers also underlined the important outcomes of the summit. And hopefully this event will also be an occasion to stimulate, as Matthew said, participation on the part of the civil society in the form of movements also from the global south. I see that this debate is actually ongoing also in the chat, so I'm very happy that you participated so actively to this event. Please keep the conversation going also after the end of this meeting, and so I wish to renew my gratefulness to the three speakers who agreed to present these observations, these reflections at such a short notice and only a few days after the end of the summit. And thank you very much to the audience for being with us. I will now stop the meeting and wish you a nice lunch break, I guess, and hope to see you at the next Rapid Reaction Seminar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chiara, for organizing the session.
You're welcome.